Welcome to the Kent Lapp Podcast.
One of the things that I have found in the publishing novel writing space is that things take a long time.
Okay.
Just to give you a little bit of perspective, it's a really fascinating process. What you do is you send out query letters, which are basically like cover letters, but they tell a little bit about your novel and a little bit about yourself. You strike the balance of pitching what the story is about and pitching yourself. You send those to prospective agents. Agents then read through your query letter. Sometimes they'll ask for sample chapters of your novel, and then they'll decide whether or not they want to represent you. That's the first step, and it's a very hard step because agents have so many. I mean, how many people do you know have said, I've got that novel that I've been working on that everybody has a story to tell. And so think about that slush pile.
Oh, for sure. And these agents, are you trying to find an agent in your city or just anywhere in America?
Anywhere.
All right.
And so after you've checked that first box, then the work is on the agent to champion for your novel to different publishing houses. And obviously you have the big ones like Random House, Penguin, HarperCollins. But of course there are countless, smaller mid-market publishing houses all over the country. And so then that begins a process of trying to get your manuscript via the agent to these prospective publishers. So it's a very long process. So in March, I submitted Running from Lions, a reworked, retooled version of Running from Lions to HarperCollins. And it wasn't until September, so March all the way to September, that I got my first email response.
Wow.
And that was relatively quickly.
Now, is this through an agent? Do you have an agent? Or did you just submit it directly somehow to HarperCollins?
This is a unique instance in which my freelance editor friend just got a job at HarperCollins, and she said, "Hey, I just befriended the acquisitions editor in fiction, and I mentioned your name and the premise. She would like to look at your manuscript." And so that felt super providential because I was able to essentially bypass that super long process of trying to find a prospective agent and get the manuscript right to the acquisitions editor at HarperCollins. So
Very
that was a
nice.
huge blessing.
If you get that deal, is it going to be Running from Lions, the second book in the saga, or the reworked, and then potentially 2 and 3?
Great question. Where we're at in the conversation is they're not keen on publishing something that was previously released.
Okay.
So what I'm working on right now is an outline packet for a new, never released trilogy in the same kind of genre.
Okay.
So Running from Lions essentially piqued their interest, got them interested in potentially publishing me, and now the conversation turns to, well, what are you working on next?
Yeah. Okay. So if you're going to have, let's say you get the deal with HarperCollins and they give you a 3-book deal, and I'm assuming they have mile markers in there with the first book absolutely flops. They're not on the hook paying you for book number 2 and 3, right?
Correct.
And is there a chance they prepay you on book 1, or is that very unlikely?
It's super interesting, and I think it depends on. I think it's case by case. So because there are it's escaping my mind right now, but I think they just call it advances, where they pay you a certain an advance, and then what you make on the back end is very small.
I see.
Authors make, it's almost criminal.
Yeah.
What authors make on the back end. Now, of course, you have all kinds of success stories like the J.K. Rowlings of the world. She wrote Harry Potter. Suzanne Collins, who wrote Hunger Games. I mean, clearly they don't ever have to do anything else.
Yeah.
But I think most published authors, even successful ones, will still be adjunct creative writing professors at a college.
Yes.
Or, do any number of different things.
I've heard as low as $1 a book after it's all said and done. That book's selling for $10.99.
Yeah.
And the author gets $1. That sounds criminal, honestly. I mean, but I guess if you think of it in terms of, because the other thing is, it's hard to sell a lot of books. And
Exactly.
so if the publisher fronts, some amount of money, they need to sell a lot of books just to make that money back. So I mean, I sort of get that.
And there's a lot of overhead for those publishing companies.
Sure.
While it doesn't necessarily cost a ton to print the books, it really doesn't. The printing isn't the cost. It's the overhead. It's the in-house acquisition editors and the payroll.
Right.
Those brick and mortar, HarperCollins and all of these other publishers are still brick and mortar businesses.
Yes.
So
True.
there's overhead with that.
Okay, so let's say you get this deal, and now you have 3 books to write, which is even a bigger deal. But even if you just bring it down to 1 book, if someone says, I'm going to pay you X amount of dollars to write a novel, write a fiction book, and that X amount is enough for you to actually do it, and then so you set off and embark on doing this, and what's a reasonable time frame to get this book done? 6 months, 12 months?
Great question. I think for something like this in this genre, young adult fiction, a first-time author who has no credibility, legitimacy, I'm at the mercy of the publisher. So what that means is, I don't have any, I don't have any say in the timeline, or I'm basically at their mercy because I'm not established. So likely what they'll do is say, okay, you have 6 months for a first draft, and so that it's then on me to set my schedule, figure out how I'm going to work that out with my 9 to 5, and get that first draft to them. And then, of course, after that, there's likely another 3 to 6 months of revisions. I'll get probably a handful of different ARC advanced reading copies where I'll have to go through and make sure everything looks good. And it's a long process. So in totality, you're looking at anywhere from a year and a half, maybe even 2 years.
It really is that long?
Yes.
Interesting.
Yes.
Do you think it would be less for nonfiction? Less time?
Great question. I think, again, it just kind of depends on the writer, on the author, on the subject matter. I think it just sort of depends.
Okay. So let's say the money that they're willing to pay you is acceptable to you and the time frame is acceptable. Let's just say it's 6 months. Now what do you do? I mean, this sounds difficult.
I know.
I mean, do you just start to go sit outside under a tree and just start to dream with your eyes closed and write down what comes to you? Do you?
I love that that's where you go first. You're just picturing me under an apple tree with a moleskin.
That must be how you write the best novels. You know what I mean? Like in the fall on a mountainside, and like it's just coming to mind, and you're just writing it, an outline, and you sit there for a couple of days, and you sleep at night and eat food, but aside from that, you're just like brainchilding this thing, or you just get all amped up on coffee and go to a coffee shop and start writing? Like, how do you even do this?
Great question. I think that, so first of all, this might fascinate you. Authors, writers in the long form narrative space, we use word counts as our mile markers. So Running from Lions, just to give you a little bit of perspective, is just under 90,000 words. So we use word counts as our kind of mile markers. So on a really good day, when the creative juices are flowing and the story is just sort of telling itself, I can probably churn out anywhere from 1,500 to 2,500 words. So if that just gives you a little bit of perspective.
So let's just say 1,500 words. Andrew, what's 90,000 divided by 1,500?
Let's see this quick math in action.
Yeah, I'm not going to do that in my head.
You're not going to Rain Man it? I was kind of expecting you to Rain Man it.
No, I'm not good at that. I did download an app last night. I was up to like 12:15 last night. It was weird. I just wasn't tired.
You were eagerly anticipating this conversation, Ken.
But the house was quiet. Everyone was sleeping, and I was just sitting in the living room on my phone watching random YouTube videos, and it was fun. And then this ad popped up on YouTube about Elevate, and then I was doing that, and it like improves your reading and writing and math and like brain and stuff. And that's where I realized, I'm not good at fast math.
90,000 divided by 1,500?
Yeah.
60.
So that's 60 days.
2 months.
Pretty good.
Yeah.
And that's a decent day.
Yeah.
Dang, that's so much.
Yeah, it is. And that's why so many creative writers, like I have so many creative writer friends who won't even leave the bed in the morning to go use the restroom or brush their teeth until they've written 500 words.
Oh, wow.
So you just have your laptop on your nightstand, and you just, you pull it over, you first thing you do, and it really becomes habitual and a discipline. But to answer your initial question, I think likely what I would do is kind of create a writing retreat for myself.
Okay.
So I would try and work it out with work where I would take, 1 to 2 weeks, and I would use those uninterrupted days to get a bulk of the writing done.
You would like go on vacation for 1 or 2 weeks.
Right.
Okay.
And I would really just hyper focus on, on that word count. And it's so funny because it sounds rote and almost like formulaic in the creative space. Like here I am trying to tell a creative, interesting, engaging story that hopefully readers will resonate.
Yeah.
And yet I've reduced it down to word count.
Right.
But you have to.
Yeah.
You have to. You can't. Some creators are afforded the opportunity to wait for inspiration to strike them. But I would say they are the exception and not the rule.
Yeah.
The rule is you have to create in structure.
Okay. So, but if you are going to pull your laptop out, say before you even get out of bed in the morning, and you're going to start writing, but first you probably have an outline, right? Like if you go somewhere for 1 or 2 weeks, the first thing you do, what's the first thing you do? It's probably not you just start writing, right? First you think about the story, the general arc of the story, some mile markers along the way, some various characters in the story, and then you start writing. And then, of course, it kind of fills out, and maybe some characters get introduced that you hadn't seen when you wrote the outline, those types of things. But do you first kind of create the general trajectory before you just start writing? Or do you just start writing?
Man, I love this question because I'm super passionate about this. An author who is a hero of mine, he's a contemporary science fiction fantasy writer. His name's Brandon Sanderson. He has distilled creative writing as an approach, as a craft, into 2 different forms of writing. One is outline writing. That's everything that you just talked about. Having a day or two where you've got your dry erase marker, your dry erase board, and you're fleshing out the story to the best of your ability with characters, plot points, the overall arc of the story, trajectory of the story. And then you use that as your roadmap for writing. The second form or approach is discovery writing. And that's where you have just the general seed of the idea, the premise. And then you just start writing. You just follow your main character or characters on this journey and just discover alongside them. I actually fall into that camp.
Wow.
I have the seed of the idea, the premise, the general idea of what's going to happen in my head, and I'll jot that down in bullet points. Maybe it's, 250 words of just, stream of consciousness. And then I just start writing. Because if I focus too much on the outlining and the road mapping of the overall narrative, I get lost in my head. I get hung up on the details. I overthink. I overcomplicate. And it becomes, that's an instance of it becoming too structured.
I see.
So I have to lean into the discovery writing piece. Now, that first draft in effect becomes an outline of sorts because that first draft isn't what's going to see the light of day. There'll be revisions. I'll figure out something in the third act with a certain character that I'm just like, oh my gosh, that's what that character has to do. Now I have to go back and plant that seed in acts 1 and 2.
I see.
So you sort of get your first draft done, then you kind of reverse engineer some things, plant the seeds where they need to be planted early on, and justify certain character decisions so that it feels cohesive and not random.
That makes total sense. Do you battle against the temptation to just use a bunch of filler words to get to 90,000 words as easily as possible? You know what I mean? Like if you're just going to sit down and just start writing, well, crap, you could write a book on just coming here into this office and leaving again. Maybe not 90,000 words, but probably 30,000, right? I mean, all the details and everything, but no one would want to read that.
Exactly.
So, but you have to use enough of detail to take people on that journey.
Exactly.
Is there a temptation to use too much detail to fill words as you go in that journey?
I think so. I think a lot of first-time young writers try to be a little bit too cute and too superfluous with their prose, and they try to make everything just seem like, super lyrical and just very like where I mean, there's nothing wrong with that writing style as long as it services the story. If it becomes, a gimmick, I think the readers are going to, see right through that.
Yes.
So I think the important thing is servicing your story. Make sure that you're engaging your reader and that it's a page turner and that the story is what's really driving the process. I will say that the biggest temptation that I fight as a writer is that temptation to reread what I've already written. I can't tell you how many hours you can burn by coming to the end of a couple of chapters and wanting to go back and reread those couple of chapters and start fine-tuning and massaging things too early.
Okay.
Keep your sights set on the finish line.
Okay.
There is a time and a place for coming back, revising, cleaning it up, massaging the narrative. That time is not during the first pass, though.
Okay. Is that time after you've done a first pass in the entire book or the first act, and then you go back?
I would say the best case scenario is at the end of the novel.
Okay.
But if you can wait until the first act, I think that's great.
Okay.
For me, I need to push through and get across that finish line until I go back. And honestly, one of the greatest things that you can do for your story is create distance between when you've completed the first draft and when you open it again. Now, obviously, traditionally published authors who are working on deadlines aren't afforded that opportunity. But one of the things that was super exciting for me in revisiting Running from Lions is I independently published that in 2013. I cracked it open and blew the dust off of it in 2019 and retooled it. So, however many years later that is. And that was hugely beneficial because I had grown as a writer, learned new techniques as a creative writer, and I was able to have an incredibly critical eye on it that I otherwise wouldn't have had a couple of weeks after writing it.
Yeah, that thought about letting it breathe, that's very interesting because very commonly I will, if it's an example, maybe this doesn't happen every time or that often, but sometimes if I'm going to say prepare for a podcast, I have plenty of time the next morning, but if I can do a little bit the night before and sleep on it, or there's something that like an idea that I'm working through, if I can have do a little bit on it the night before, then let it rest overnight, come back to it. Something about letting it rest just a little bit, even though this is just an example, and you're not talking about letting it rest overnight. You're talking about letting it rest for weeks or months.
Yes.
But I think it might be the same thing. Whatever that is, just to let it sit a little bit, let it breathe. Just when you sleep on something, I feel like your brain sort of subconsciously processes it. There's some benefits there. Andrew, can you pull up the psychopath test? Chad Stevens, who was just on the podcast, I think it was last week, brought up this book, The Psychopath Test. And the reason I'm bringing it up is because the author, who is the author?
John Ronson.
John Ronson. He also wrote Men Who Stare at Goats, I believe. And I've not read that book, but I think that's a fairly popular book.
I'm familiar with his work, yeah.
So this book it's a nonfiction book, and it's about psychopaths, quite frankly. And it is written so the reason I'm bringing this up is because this touches on detail and bringing people in the story, but not being superfluous. I mean, this book is incredibly hard to put down. I'm halfway through, and I've only sat down to read it 2 or 3 times. And if I had time, and Chad mentioned on the podcast, he read the entire book on a Saturday. He never does that before. He said he's like me, which he reads fairly slow, and he comes back and rereads some things. That's exactly how I read too. I underline a lot. Like I feel like I have enough of ADD to. It makes it hard to kind of concentrate, and so I have to like reread some sentences a lot, and when I read, and it's a little, but this book, it's written in a way that is super compelling, and it's extremely hard to put down, and he's writing in story. So like he's talking about, it's basically the story of him kind of visiting academics and professors and visiting jail cells and going to Wall Street and visiting all these people, interviewing them about psychopaths and why they, killed those 3 people, and then they thought they were fixed, and you let them out, and then they killed other people. And that's a psychopath, and they have no empathy. And so he's not just like stating the facts, he's telling the story of him doing these interviews and meeting these people and what it was like. And you just are along for the ride. I mean, it's remarkable. So he has the right mix of detail, story, facts, and it's not too much, and it's not, it's just, so man, it's like Target says, when it fits, you feel it. You know what I mean? When
Yes.
it's just right, it's just right.
Yes.
So coming back to your writing,